Good afternoon and welcome to weeks 3 and 4 of LER 410. This is going to be a shorter lecture. I have posted just now a list of key terms that I think it's important that you're familiar with under the readings and notes section of this segment. And right now, I just want to kind of talk through some of the things that struck me as important to be dealing with in these readings. So the purpose of this segment is really to understand how employment has begun to evolve under the structure of the EU. So unlike the previous segment where we went way back in history and looked at the evolution of the EU so we could all kind of get on the same page, we're now moving into the area of employment where we will remain for the rest of the semester. But I think what's really important from these readings, and Gold highlights this in his chapter 2, is understanding how employment has been handled over time within the EU. And there's this shift that we've seen where early on, and I'm just pulling up my notes, early on, we see there being a pretty clear structure, sort of a simplified yet fairly bureaucratic structure for employment, right? Where you're kind of establishing these 4 pillars of employment guidelines: employability, entrepreneurship, adaptability, and equal opportunities, right? Each EU state is supposed to come up with, a joint employment report and engage with their social partners. So that's kind of the straightforward approach. However, that begins to change over time, and I believe it changes for a number of reasons. One, as Gold highlights, the EU brings in new members, right? Smaller countries that have smaller economies and newer, less developed economies as the Cold Wars come to an end. But I also think, and he doesn't emphasize this quite as much, but also, during the 70s into the 80s, we also have the rise of sort of a neoliberal economic policy. And while labor unions and other kind of social partners and this idea of social dialogue that we read about in the last segment are really linchpins in much of the EU policies and part of the EU discussions in a way that they just aren't anymore in the United States. Gold doesn't really emphasize the role that neoliberal policies are starting to play and influence within the EU and then also globally. And I think that also is a key component to the shift away from this idea of these 4 pillars to these, I don't know, they eventually, under the strategy for growth and jobs, narrowed it down to sort of 3 objectives and 29 indicators. But initially there were 24 guidelines, 35 key indicators, all meant to help you guide your employment policy. And of course, they expanded how long you had to come up with your joint employment report from 1 year to 3 years. But 1 year you could dedicate a whole office to coming up with the report and then have absolutely no time to implement it. So I would agree that the 3-year time period makes a lot more sense for countries because it allows for time to both study and figure out what your country needs, as well as to try implementing it and then evaluate. Trying to navigate multiple guidelines, objectives, and indicators is quite a bureaucracy to handle. So, but I think that's important to understand. And the other piece of that I think is really critical is the fact that at the beginning process, we see social partners as part of the dialogue and part of the conversation. By the end, when we get to the strategy for growth and jobs, the social partnership dialogue seems to be lost or absent, which is where I think getting into the Mirdi reading on economic integration and state responses is really beneficial. So looking at the countries, he focuses on 6 of the largest EU countries since 1992. How have the different criteria influenced the ways in which those countries have responded to employment? So foreign investment, migration, of course, as well as, I thought there was a third. I just skipped it. Migration, foreign investment, and I guess those were the 2 main ones. I thought I had a third. I guess just the EU policy more generally. That's pretty important to think about those two